Okay, record on this computer. That way we just have them. We can put them on our church YouTube and stuff. All right, fantastic. So let me go ahead and share my screen again because I am going to share PowerPoint. Here we go. You guys can see that there. How to share when they don't care. Just give me a moment before I launch. All right, so how to share when they don't care, part one. This is going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. I want to begin. I'm going to share some statistics or quotes rather with you guys in a minute, but I want to begin just by laying this foundation here. Oftentimes, when it comes to sharing our faith in the world today, you're going to be met with different responses. Sometimes the response will be hostility. Have any of you experienced hostility when trying to share your faith before?
Well, a little bit, not
Bit, yep.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yep. So sometimes you'll experience hostility at different levels. Some might experience it very heavy. Some might experience just slight little annoyances. Others might experience it quite intensely. I was talking with Barry yesterday, and he was sharing experience he's having with different people right now as he's sharing his faith. Definitely some tense hostility there. Other times you'll have someone who's actually interested, and you can have a really good conversation. How many of you guys have experienced that?
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Always amazing, isn't it, when you start sharing with someone and there's that link and they're excited and they want to hear what you have to say, and you get to talk and share your faith. Always really exciting. The final one, which is about to show up on the screen, is one that is not something that you necessarily. I guess it depends on where you are or who you're talking to. So you may experience it or may not experience it, but it is becoming more and more common, and that is just plain disinterest. Not angry about the fact that you're a Christian or that you want to share with me. It doesn't upset me, but I'm kind of just don't really care. Maybe. Anyone here experienced that before?
Yeah, a little bit. I was talking to a lady who was, she used to be a doctor, and she's like, I know all about life. You don't need to tell me anymore.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. And Seth, I saw you nodding your hair there. I can't see Dave's face because he or Ebenezer's. But yeah, there seems to be a trend that's increasing where people are no longer necessarily angry at the church, although you'll definitely still find that people who get angry about religion. But there seems to be an increasing trend where people aren't necessarily angry; they're just kind of meh, they don't care either way. And so this is why I titled this initial presentation, How to Share When They Don't Care. So I want to focus on this disinterest because it's becoming more of a common trend, especially with younger generations. You're trying to engage younger generations by sharing your faith. You won't necessarily get the response that you used to get back in 2000 when Richard Dawkins was really popular and the new atheists were running around and people would get angry at you and say, what about the Crusades and what about this and that? You don't necessarily run into that so much anymore. What you just run into is just, oh, okay. Yeah, cool. I mean, I'm glad it works for you. Moving on with my life now, so I want to engage that a little bit. Oh, sorry, this didn't go forward like I expected it to. Okay, so I'm just going to read a few report things here just to bring this home a little bit. 52% of Australian 13 to 18-year-olds identify themselves as nuns. That is a short term that basically means they have no spiritual or religious beliefs. And so it's going to be interesting to see what the new census says as well, because a lot of this is based on the older census. So I'm really interested to see what the new census will say. But 52%, that's quite a lot. Over half of Australian young people don't identify with any religious belief whatsoever. So they might believe that there's a God, they might have spiritual beliefs, but they don't associate with any church, with any denomination, with any religion. The proportion of Australians identifying Christianity as their religion has been declining over the last century from 96% oh, sorry, I was just letting Barry in, from 96% in 1911 to 61% in the 2011 census. So massive, massive dip there. So over the last decade, Christianity in Australia has declined from 68 to 61%. So between 1911 and 2011, huge dip from, what was that, 96% to 61%. And then 10 years after that, after 2011, another 10% it dropped. So again, it's going to be really interesting to see what the new census says. You can see there's definitely a decline in people associating with Christianity. Another one, over the last 4 decades, the number of Australians selecting no religion on the census has more than tripled from 6.7, which was 1971, to 22.3, which was 2011. So that's from the McCrindle research. They basically do lots of census research. Just a few more. I'm not gonna nail you guys to the wall with a bunch of these, because I think we all generally get it, but it's nice to see some of this official stats from time to time. So this is from ABC News. This one was pretty hard hitting. It says, hold on a second, let me just shift this. It says Australia is not a country in which religious belief is the dominant determinant of identity, social status, or indeed even social activity. When given a list of 8 attributes and asked which was most central to the respondents' sense of self and identity, Australians placed religion stone cold, motherless last. That seems to be the trend. Here's another one. And this one does wonders for my for my career, you guys. When asked who they trusted, Australians opted for doctors and nurses, trusted by 97%, and scientists, 93%. Well ahead of their preachers. Religious leaders, like myself, were distrusted by a full 70% of the population, with 35% saying they didn't trust them at all. Oh. So that does wonders for my ego. I wasn't surprised, to be honest, by that. Here's what this is. All of this is basically saying in plain English: everyday Australians don't care about us or our church. And by that, I don't mean that they hate our church or that they're angry at us. It's just that on a personal level, we kind of just don't exist. Church is not on their radar. So this reminds me, and you guys have heard me tell this story before, of a doctor I worked with before I started pastoring here in Perth. And I told him, hey, I'm going to go be a pastor. And he looked me square in the eye and he said, what's that? So I tried saying, I'm kind of like a chaplain, but I don't work in a hospital. I work in a church. And he said to me, what's a chaplain? And I was like, oh man, there goes my brilliant response. Throw that out the window. So I said to him, how do you not know what a chaplain is? You were a doctor, you worked in the emergency department, you must have seen chaplains. And his response to me was, yeah, I actually did see the chaplain around all the time, but I didn't know what he did and I never bothered to ask. So that's sort of the norm, right? In Australian culture, Australian society, it's people are born and they live and they die, and the church is not something that they ever really think about. Now, of course, they do still have deep spiritual hunger. They just don't necessarily think, I'll go to church to satisfy that or to find answers. We're kind of not on the radar. So for me, the question then is, how did we get here? And this is where I kind of want to do a little bit of a presentation, because when you're confronted with a world or a society in which people are uninterested in God, or apathetic, if we want to use a bigger word, apathy, apathetic toward God, or just plainly, like I said, disinterested, we have 2 options as Christians on how we engage that. The first is we can simply say, well, they're not interested because they're not interested, and that's the end of it. Maybe they prefer their sin, and so they just want to, stay there and not talk about God. Or maybe the second option is we can try and understand what the reasons could be behind why they feel that way, behind why they respond that way. So what I want to do is I want to actually take you guys on a little bit of a journey. I call it an ideas map. I want to walk through a little bit of an ideas map. It's going to be simplified because I don't want to get this too complicated, but I want to take us on a journey to try and understand Why are so many people today increasingly uninterested in conversations about God? Now, I will tell you ahead of time, a lot of what I'm going to say in this presentation are going to be presenting ideas and shifts in the way people think in society that none of us here agree with. And so the temptation when you're encountering ideas that are unbiblical or untrue or that we don't agree with, the temptation is to look at them with contempt. But I actually want to invite you to seek to do your absolute best. Pray for the Holy Spirit to just give you humility to try and understand. We don't have to agree, but at least understand, why are people thinking this way? Why are they relating to God and Jesus and religion in this particular way? So I'm going to go through this ideas map. This shouldn't take too long. I'm going to start out with this cathedral. All right, we're going to call this cathedral. We're going to walk through a little map here that I have on the screen. It's going to unfold as we go. And our journey begins at this little cathedral. All right. Now, the cathedral represents a time in human history in which most of society believed that truth was found in religion. Pretty simple. I don't think there's any rocket science there. There was a time in human history where just about everybody admitted, if you need truth, if you're on a search for truth, you can find that truth that you're looking for in religion. You can find it in the sacred book, the Bible. You can find it in the preacher or the priest, whatever it was, the dominant religion or denomination in that time. But for the most part, people believed if you are searching for truth, here's where you're going to find it. And in fact, this isn't entirely dead. If you go to Muslim societies today, for example, a place like Iran or Saudi Arabia, this is still how people relate to the world around them. Truth is found in the imam, in the mosque, in the Quran, right? So there's this idea that the truth is centered there. And in the West, it used to be the same. If you wanted truth, the cathedral was the place that you went to find truth. And the truth that was being proclaimed in this church space is a truth that was supposed to give us hope, right? It was supposed to help us confront the challenges of life, disappointments, the struggle with sin, the pain, the suffering of life. And it would give us hope, hope in Jesus, hope in his promises, hope in his message. But what ended up happening, and again, I'm simplifying things here because this isn't a history lesson. So if anyone wants to go deeper, you certainly can at a separate time, because if I try and go deeper, we'll be here for like 5 hours and nobody wants that. Yes. But essentially what happened was during the age of the cathedral, as I'm calling it, where people saw truth in religion and truth was this thing that could give us hope, is that this is also the age in which we encountered as a human species things like holy wars, the Crusades, a lot of injustice coming from the church. Those of us who've studied Daniel, the visions of Daniel, are very familiar with this. A lot of oppression coming from the church, the persecution of the saints, a lot of corruption coming from the church. And it wasn't just the medieval Catholic Church. It happened with the Protestant churches as well during the Protestant Reformation. Lots of suffering, lots of corruption, lots of injustice, lots of war, lots of bloodshed in the name of religion. And so essentially what happened in the culture is people said, if there is truth to be found, it's not there. And so around this time, the world began moving away toward from the age of the cathedral to what we can call the age of science, right? And at this point, what people began to believe was that truth was going to be found not in religion, but in science. If you trust the scientific method, if you look for empirical evidence, and you only believe what you can put in a test tube, that's how we are going to find truth. And during this age, during the age of the laboratory, people came to believe that the future was looking bright. I mean, science is going to help us advance in medicine, is going to help us advance in education. It's going to give us technological revolutions. Life is going to become easier and better and simpler, and we are headed toward utopia. And so people began shifting from truth is only to be found in the cathedral to actually there's no truth there. All that brought us was suffering and war and injustice. So we're going to put our faith in science. And here's where you start to see a lot of things. This, if you want to put it in your minds historically, this was sort of taking place just before the time of Ellen White, essentially. And when she was alive, it was still very strong in full swing. And so people are turning to truth, to science and the scientific method, and they're no longer believing, can you prove that God exists? Scientifically, of course you can, and you get all of that stuff mixing around. But the point is, people still believed that truth was there, and that if you trusted the scientific method, you would find it. That's the point. And they believed that through this trust in science, we would arrive at utopia. The world was going to be fantastic. We were going to cure all the diseases. We might even cure aging and live forever. I mean, it's going to be fantastic and wonderful. And instead, what happened was science gave us World War I, World War II, the atomic bomb, and weapons of mass destruction. And so the utopia that science promised never arrived. And instead, what we found was the very same science that we thought was going to give us our hope for the future ended up being the tool that allowed us to create the most destructive weapons that humanity had ever seen. And this is an interesting point to keep in mind, because every single one of us in this chat, from the moment we were born until now, we've been aware of things like atomic bombs. Right? Like we know they exist. We know they can wipe out the earth, right? Prior to the atomic bomb being created between 40s and 50s, no one really thought about it. No one really thought about the possibility that, with the push of a button, we can wipe out all life on earth. Whereas now it's kind of common knowledge. Obviously we believe that through God's providence, that's not going to happen. But think about the big shift in people's thinking from, the most destructive thing in the world is what, a cannon, to all of a sudden an A-bomb that can literally wipe out all life on earth. This is a huge shift. And so essentially what happened is the culture looked at science that it had put all of its trust in, and it said, nah, we can't trust in science either. Religion let us down. Science let us down. And so where does that leave us, right? If religion let you down and science let you down, where do you go? Where are you going to go for truth? Well, here's where something really interesting actually happened. It started happening just after World War II and leading up to about the 80s. People no longer trusted in religion. They no longer trusted in science. In fact, what they began to argue was the problem with religion is it told us it had the truth and it let us down. And the problem with science is it told us it had the truth and it let us down. So maybe the problem is there's no such thing as truth. Maybe truth just doesn't exist. And so that brought us into what I'll call the age of the maze, okay? So think of a maze where people are wandering lost with nowhere to go, no starting point, no ending point. They're just wandering around completely lost. The age of the maze. This is when people began to embrace the idea that truth doesn't exist. And you might have encountered this at some point. Maybe you've heard people say things like, yeah, look, if that's true for you, that's great, but it's not true for me, right? If Jesus is if you believe Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, that's great for you, but I believe it's Krishna and or Buddha, and your truth and my truth are different, and that's okay. What essentially is being communicated there is there's no such thing as an absolute truth that we can put our trust in. It's just whatever you want, really. Just pick what works for you, and that's it. So this all came about in the age of the maze. The other thing that really came about during the age of the maze is that anytime somebody claims to have absolute truth, that's actually a power play to justify oppression. And this is probably the most interesting and most important thing you have to remember as a Christian witnessing today, is that most people came to see truth as a gimmick through which we can justify our mistreatment of other people. So go back to the age of the cathedral, right? Go back to the age of the church. When the transatlantic slave trade began, where Western nations were doing, engaging in the slave trade, the politicians realized we're not going to be able to keep this up for long because the population is not going to support us going into a tribal country, stealing, kidnapping their people and selling them for slavery. Eventually, people are going to get upset. and they needed a way to appease people's conscience. And so what did they do? They went to the church and they said, church, we need a theological paradigm that will justify slavery. And that's exactly what the church gave them. You had ideas, for example, that slavery was what was going to be, it was necessary to save the savage. That was a common theme back in those days, right? Slavery is necessary because this is how we'll save the savage. When you had people coming into the Americas and Canada, where they would displace the Native Americans and take their children away from them, these ideas were used as well. Oh, God has giving us the responsibility of subduing the pagans and bringing them to Christ. And so you'll have someone like Christopher Columbus land in America and basically say to the Native Americans, if you don't surrender to us, we will take your land and kill your men and rape your women in the name of Jesus Christ. I mean, this is absolute. We think about this now and we're like, how is that possible that anyone could even think that way? And if you go back to the age of the laboratory, right, the age of science, science was used the same way, right? Like if you go back to Nazi Germany, they were using science to justify what they were doing to minorities. And even in America, the churches were fully complicit in things like slavery, and they would even use eugenics, which was a fake science, but they claimed it was real science. And eugenics was this idea that certain races of people are more evolved than others. And so because of that, it justifies oppression and inequality and slavery. And so during the age of the maize, people are looking at this and they're saying every time somebody claims to have the truth, what they really mean is I'm justifying my mistreatment of somebody else. And that still trickles to today. So a lot of times today, when people are either hostile or uninterested in truth, this stuff is in the background. When you and I hear truth as Seventh-day Adventists, right, as people of the book, as people who believe in the present truth, when you and I hear truth, what we hear in our mind is truth is freedom from lies. Truth is freedom from the deceptions of Satan, right? Truth is freedom from the lies that Satan has been telling about God since the beginning of time. Truth sets us free from that. But when the culture, particularly people who've never been to church today, when they hear truth, what they hear is oppression. What they hear is a gimmick to justify mistreating somebody and oppressing them, et cetera, et cetera. So this is probably like the most important, like if you're going to forget anything that I say, and you probably will forget a lot, but don't forget this is so important. Most people today, when they hear the word truth, they don't hear what you and I hear. We hear beauty and enthusiasm. They hear like, oh, be careful, because the last time somebody claimed to have truth, they showed up at the shores with a bunch of slaves, right? So this was very, very prevalent during the age of the maize. And so what this then did is it left the culture with this cynicism. They were cynical about the future. The future is not headed anywhere good. We're not going anywhere. There's no utopia waiting for us. There's no beauty. There's no enthusiasm. The world's probably just going to devolve into a wasteland, an atomic wasteland with people struggling to survive. And a perfect example of that would be the very popular Australian movie franchise Mad Max. All right, so the movie franchise Mad Max is an outplay of this way of seeing the world, that the world is chaotic and messed up and there's no such thing as truth, and eventually there's going to be some sort of nuclear war and the earth is just going to be this wasteland with people living like animals struggling to survive, and that's the best that we can hope for, right? Because if there's no truth and there's no anchor to guide us, then we're not headed anywhere. It's just, the idea that we're progressing is false. So this all is happening during the age of the maize. But thankfully, the world eventually realized this is a really terrible way to live. Let's not live this way anymore. So in our map, we move away from the age of the maize, which if you want to put it in your head within a time frame, about the 70s, people started to move away from this. Not entirely, those things aren't perfect, there's always bleed over. But people did eventually say, we can't live like this anymore. And so that brought us to the age of the pendulum. Now, what do I mean by the age of the pendulum? It's possible that most of you were familiar with everything I've said up to this point. At least, at least you maybe have been exposed to these ideas at some point before. The time when people thought truth was in religion, the time when people thought truth was in science, and the time when people realized or came to the conclusion that truth didn't exist. You may be familiar with those, but this one is one I find most people tend to be less familiar with. The age of the pendulum. So what's the age of the pendulum? The age of the pendulum basically says this: truth doesn't exist. That's true, which is an oxymoron in and of itself, right? If you claim truth doesn't exist, but that statement is supposed to be true, then it just collapses on itself. But here's what people are saying. All right, so truth doesn't exist, but we can't live cynically because it's just just a terrible way to live. So the people in the maze were very cynical, and we don't want to live that way. So even though truth doesn't exist, we can't be cynical, and so we have to oscillate, which basically means bounce back and forth between anti-truth of the maze and the enthusiasm of religion and science, right? Religion and science gave us this promise for the future, which was lost in the maze because there's no such thing as truth. Well, we're still going to believe there's no such thing as truth, but we want to live with enthusiasm. So we're just going to bounce back and forth between those two. Now, if you're sitting here and you're confused and you're like, how in the world does that make any sense? It's okay. You probably will be confused and wonder how in the world that's supposed to make any sense. And I'm right there with you. Right? Like I said, lots of unbiblical ideas here, but all I'm doing is presenting how people are relating to the world around them. And so this oscillation, this pendulum swing where we swing from one side to the other, becomes the new way that people begin to engage the world around them. Okay, so there's no such thing as truth, but I want to live with enthusiasm. Okay, so the universe isn't headed anywhere good. It's eventually going to implode, and all memory that we were ever here is going to be completely erased. But I'm going to live with happiness and thankfulness and joy. It's like they're almost contradictory, right? So what this does then is it leads us to the end of our map for tonight. It leads us to the end of our map to what I call the city of Meh. Now, Meh is a common phrase that young people use a lot today. And it basically means, I don't care. That's essentially what Meh means. The city of Meh is the city of, I don't care. And so what happens then is when people begin to swing between the cynicism and the enthusiasm of the maze and religion, it begins to show up as apathy, right? Because this is a weird way to live. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't have cohesion. But you're just too exhausted to think about the claims of Jesus or the claims of religion. So you just become apathetic. You just stop caring, and that guy thinks he has the truth, and so does that guy, and I don't have time to read all those books and watch all those DVDs, and that church did all that, and that scientist did all that, and that philosopher doesn't know what, who knows what the truth, who knows what anyone's talking about. I just don't have the time for it. I don't have the energy for it. It's all too confusing and exhausting. So I'm just going to go to work, and I'm going to buy a house, and I'm going to have a beer on the weekends while I watch the footy. And that's pretty much it. And anything outside of that, I really don't care. Apathy. So this is the age of the whatevs and the age of meh. So this is our map, guys. We started out as truth is in religion, and we've moved through these. And again, this is very central to the way it's happened in the West. So I'm from a Latin culture, right? The world that I come from in Puerto Rico, for example, the map doesn't look like this. Right? If you come from Africa, if you come from the islands, it's likely that your map doesn't look like this either from your country. This is pretty much the Western. So America, Canada, the UK, Australia. That's what we're looking at here. So we're in the city of Meh. All right. So this Meh manifests as apathy, whatever, I don't care. So let me explain that a little bit. Apatheism. This is from a book by the title of Apatheism by Kyle Bashir. He says this: atheism believes that God does not exist. Agnosticism believes that we can't know whether or not God exists. Apatheism believes God's existence to be irrelevant. It says we shouldn't care about him at all. And this is the increasing trend within Western societies like Australia. It's not so much atheism or agnosticism anymore. It's apatheism. It's just the notion that, look, it just doesn't matter. And if you want to argue about God and debate religion, be my guest. I'm going to go have a barbecue and drink a beer. And I'm happy with that, right? Apatheism then is when a person believes God is irrelevant. He just pointless conversation. And I just feel apathetic toward him. So again, how did we get here? We looked at our map. We had the cathedral where religion promised and failed to deliver. And so people basically today will tend to say that religion has its social benefits, but it doesn't contain truth. Science promised and failed to deliver. It has technological benefits. It's given us the iPhone and this Zoom session that we are pleasantly enjoying right now from the comfort of our homes. So it gives us technological benefits, but it doesn't contain truth either. And so postmodernism, that's basically the age of the maze. It deconstructed both science and religion. And it exposed that both of these claims for truth were really about power, people who wanted power, and they wanted an excuse to justify their power. And so we threw away truth. But then we discovered that we want a better world, and postmodernism couldn't engineer that because it's too cynical. So we get to the pendulum, which is what's called metamodernism. And it's on this mission, right? I want you to follow me here. Metamodernism, which is essentially where the culture is today, it's on a mission to rebuild the world. They want to reconstruct the world. They want to reconstruct society. So think about phenomenons today like social justice or the ecological movement or political revolution. This is all a manifestation of this. We want to rebuild the world. We want to rebuild the economy. The Great Reset. Think about things like that. Elon Musk traveling to Mars to build a city. All these things are examples of we want to rebuild the world. We want a better world, and we're going to work toward it. And here's the thing. In this better world that we want to build, religion and science, they cannot get us there. But they can help a little bit here and there. Like we're not going to be angry and discount it and throw it away like the new atheists did in the early 2000s. Religion, it has its social benefits, and science, obviously it gives us technology. So they can help. But we're not going to build this new world through them, okay? And so in the city of Meh, which is where people live now, religion is just another option among many options that can lead us forward. There is no singular religion or singular truth. They all have equal claim. So pick what works for you and join the reconstruction. And when you come along and say, hey, I'm an Adventist with present truth for this generation, and here's the truth that I have to proclaim to you, in a world that says, meh, it's frustrating to say the least. So I want to look at this from another angle, and then we'll be getting ready to close. So think of this city of Meh that people inhabit now. It's a metaphor, obviously, but think of this city as a new city that's been under construction for the last 100 years. What tools and objects has the culture used to build this apathetic Meh metropolis? Again, let's look at our map. You've got the cathedral, which is religion as a power tool, as a tool of oppression. You think of the papacy, think of the Crusades, think of the Inquisitions, and that's just the Catholics. Let's go to the Protestants now. Think of the Irish Protestant Catholic wars, which were absolutely horrendous. Think of how Protestants persecuted each other. The Anabaptists are a perfect example. The Anabaptists were persecuted mostly by Luther and Calvin and their followers. And the preferred way of getting rid of an Anabaptist was to drown them, because they believed that baptism was by full immersion. It's like, oh, you want to be fully immersed? We'll drown you, right? And these are Christians doing it to each other. So religion is a power tool. The elites control that narrative, and they use it to subjugate, to colonize, and to exploit. So that's one of the basic building blocks of this city that we're building with, is this belief that religion is this power tool. On the other side, science is the same thing. It doesn't get a pass on this. Science is a power tool. The elites control the evidence. Whoever's in power can tell you what the scientific truth is. And we're seeing this at play today. I think we were just talking with Jill earlier about the division and the tension and the politicization, sorry, I think I messed that word up, of something like the vaccine, right? And the whole COVID scenario. There are some people who are like, yeah, let's do it. And then there's this huge swathe of the population that's like, I don't trust what's happening at all. This is all based on this idea that we can't trust science, and we can't trust religion, and we can't trust government. We can't trust anything because nobody has truth. And anyone who claims to have the truth, they're just looking for a way to control you. That's it, right? So they use this supposed truth then to oppress women, to oppress BIPOC, that is Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQ communities. If you can claim a truth claim that you can use to justify your oppression of them, that's how governments have used science. So that becomes the basic building block of this city. And then you have the maze. There's no such thing as absolute truth. We're skeptical of any story that's big, that tries to tie the human story together, a meta-narrative. And no truth is actually a relief, which is the most bizarre thing that I've ever encountered in my many conversations with secular people, is the notion that when I discovered that there's no such thing as truth, it was such a relief. I'm like, I was the opposite. Like when I found truth, that was the relief, you know? But for them, it's like, oh, there's no such thing as truth. Oh, what a relief, you know? And don't make the mistake of assuming that that's because they just want to go drink and have fun and be debaucherous. Because actually, a lot of secular people that I know, friends of mine, are extremely well-regulated, moral people. The reason why no truth is relief isn't because they're looking for an excuse to go and party and have a great time, although some of them probably are, but it's because they think that truth is a power tool that people use to oppress. That's why. And so if there is no such thing as truth, then I don't have to subjugate myself to somebody's oppression. And so we're constructing a new world. God and science are tools among the many. And we begin to build this new world through all these mixed match of different things. So for example, you have things like CRISPR, where we are editing our genes. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. You can Google these afterwards, or whenever you want during the week. You'll have fun exploring some of these. CRISPR is this technological scientific thing that's it's being debated right now, but the idea is we can edit our genes, right? And if we edit our genes, we can get rid of all diseases. We can possibly even get rid of the gene that makes us age. And if we can get rid of the gene that makes us age, we can become immortal. And so for the first time in human history, a topic that used to belong only to religion, immortality, is now purely secular. Now we can talk about immortality without any reference to God or faith at all, because we can edit our genes, right? Multi-planet species, Elon Musk, you guys have seen Jeff Bezos going up into Mars. They want to build a city on Mars. And the reason why they want to build this city on Mars isn't simply because they want to advance technologically. It's because, and Elon Musk said this in an interview that I watched with him, he believes that if an asteroid were to hit the Earth and wipe out the human species, or there was a nuclear war, we're gone because we only live on one planet. He calls it existential vulnerability. We only live on one planet. But if we start moving into other planets in our solar system, we're not so vulnerable anymore. So it's almost like a self-salvation, but there's no religion attached to it. It's a type of legalism without the religion. We're trying to save ourselves in a non-religious way. Humanity plus, transhumanism. The idea that humanity, through blending humanity with technology, we can step into the next stage of our evolution. We can advance into the next stage of our evolution. And one of the most incredible things about this conversation right now that's taking place in transhuman conversations is they're looking for a way to digitize a person's mind so that they can live forever, number one. But number two, if they were to die, you can resurrect them because you have a perfect copy of their consciousness, of their mind. And so once again, another topic that used to belong squarely only to the religious domain, right? Resurrection. Now there's an entirely secular way of talking about it. If we can digitize a person's mind and consciousness and make a copy of that, if the person dies, we can resurrect them. We can make a new one, right? It's absolutely bonkers. But these are the mix matching of all these different ideas that emerge in this attempt to rebuild the world. The eco movement. And look, some of these we can actually resonate with to some degree, like obviously as Sabbath keepers, we believe in creation and the beauty of the earth and taking care of the earth. But some of these movements go a little bit beyond that and begin to look at ways in which we can redeem ourselves through ecological reform. And sometimes these are deeply political ideas that are really complicated. I'm not going to get into that now. But the whole idea, the whole premise, for example, the whole aim of secular social justice movements is to create a global village where everyone has and nobody has not. And how you achieve that in a world where people are naturally selfish is you have to rely on power and you have to rely on politics. And that's not going to end well. So perennialism is basically the mixing of all different religious ideas, and it's a big mix match. We throw all of these in the pot, we blend it, and whatever comes out, we try and rebuild the world with that. So in that context, anytime you come along and say, there is a truth, there is an absolute truth, and it's found in Jesus only, the typical response will be just disinterest. Now, again, you'll still have people who will be hostile, and you'll still have people who will be interested, but you're also going to increasingly find people who just don't seem angry, they don't seem interested, they just meh, they don't really care. Here's another quote from that Kal Bashir's guy. 5 centuries ago in the West, the existence of God was automatically assumed. It was nearly impossible not to believe in God, especially the triune God of Christianity. But today, belief in him has been challenged by countless alternatives. That's a key phrase there, countless alternatives. We have morphed from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God to one in which faith, even for the staunchest believer, is one human possibility among others. So it's when you have that big sort of, all these possibilities is where people begin to become more and more apathetic. But it gets worse. And here's why it gets worse, because not only are there all these competing ideas, but in the Western world, we are extremely comfortable and extremely distracted, right? The comfort and the distraction of Western society are so huge that if a person is even remotely nudged by the Holy Spirit, they can turn that off by just flipping their phone on or going down to the shop and watching a new movie or buying a new dress or a new pair of shoes or, I don't know, a new football. And we're constantly comforted and we're constantly distracted in Western culture. And so it's in this soil, Kyle says, contestability, diversity, comfort, and distraction, that apatheism, that's apathy toward anything to do with God, not only grows, but flourishes. First, people lack a reason to care about God because of secularism, which is all the other stuff we've talked about already. And second, people lack the motivation to care about God because of affluence and technology. I can just distract myself. I don't have to deal with these uncomfortable discussions. Flip on the telly, turn on Netflix, I'm dead to the world. In the end, though, the apatheist dismissal of God robs us of all of the minimally common interest to discuss God questions. So that, usually when you want to discuss God, you need a minimal sort of anchor that you can both sort of tie to and say, all right, let's have this conversation. But for apatheism, it seems that anchor doesn't exist. So how do you engage them, right? How do you have the conversation? It seems impossible to start and sustain a conversation about God without it being terminated by disinterest, undermined by secularism, muted by comfort, or derailed by distraction. But it gets even worse. It gets even worse, all right? Here's what it is. We started out in our map. We have the city, started out the age of the cathedral. We moved into the age of science. We moved into the age of the maze. We moved into the age of the pendulum. And we finally arrived at the city of Meh. And here's where it becomes really, really my challenge to each of you as we think about these things and we think about the world around us. Because again, it's very, very easy to respond to all of this by simply saying, I'm going to be meh as well. I'm going to be apathetic to the changes in the world as well. I'm just going to continue to do what I've always done and not care if people engage or not. That's their problem, right? We can respond that way. But when I think about Jesus and I think about how God incarnated in human flesh and he moved into our neighborhood and he walked among us and he basically reached out to us and provided us redemption by coming close to us, right? I think this is a model for how we should engage the world always, that we should seek to incarnate, which is to come close, to understand, to do life with, and to find ways in which we can bring the message of Jesus into places and cultures and generations that have walls built up against him. And so here's where I think the challenge gets a little bit more difficult, because we've moved in the Western world through this giant map all the way from the cathedral to the city of Meh. Most people now live here in the city of Meh. But when it comes to how we relate to the world around us, most Christians are still here in the age of the cathedral. We still live and act as though the world was like it was back then, and we engage with people around us as though the world is still the way it was back then, even though the world has moved on significantly. So what this means then is, despite the massive changes in the world around us, the majority of the church's evangelism, outreach, and discipleship model is still designed for the world of the cathedral. And this isn't bad. This isn't an insult. Because there are still many people who respond to that, right? And there are many people who are still in the age of the laboratory. You know, like, it's not like the whole world is living in the city of man. You need different approaches. But my challenge to you as a Christian, as a missionary, especially in a city like Joondalup, where roughly 50% of the people are in this category of deeply secular, my challenge to you would be, seek to understand that world, and through the agency of the Holy Spirit, to find effective ways to connect with those neighbors and those friends. Just because someone has rejected you and rejected your attempt to share your faith doesn't necessarily mean that person's uninterested in God and they're unsavable and they're just, a staunch sinner who can't be reached. It could simply mean that the approach that you used was probably an approach that would have worked better in a cathedral age, not in a city of meh age. And so if you can learn that and adapt, it can be really helpful. We might be in the city of men, but we haven't redesigned our approach or equipped our members to engage in apathetic post-God, post-Christian, and post-truth world. And I think that's what we're dealing with here. I had a friend of mine that I'm discipling. I've been discipling him for 2 years now. We have a great relationship and really fun journey. And I first met him when he came to Vic Park Church some years ago. And it was really interesting because while he was at the church, someone gave him a book. He was a visitor. He's a secular Buddhist. And he only came because we had a vegetarian cooking class, and he was a plant-based one, and he was vegan. And so he was really intrigued by that. So he came along, and then he came to church and he listened, and he came for a few weeks and then he stopped attending. So I caught up with him to find out why did you stop attending? Did somebody offend you? Did somebody, say something rude? Nothing like that at all. In fact, he told me the opposite. Very friendly church, very wonderful people, good memories. I enjoyed your message. But what seemed to be the thing that really scared him off was someone gave him a book while he was visiting. And I don't know what book it was, but it was a book. It was one of those very old books with lots of religious art, like very old religious art. And he'd never seen anything like this before. So he didn't know how to interpret it. And he immediately thought to himself, like, for example, he told me there were some images of like people burning in hell, which obviously as Adventists, we don't believe that. But if that imagery is in a book, we can interpret it, whereas he couldn't. So immediately turned him off. And he said, forget it. I don't think I want to associate with this kind of, religion or ideology. I'm just going to leave. And it would have been really easy for me to assume, oh, he's just not interested in God. But I didn't assume that. I caught up with him. I listened to him. I discussed with him. And even though he never went back to that church, and I doubt he ever will, I still catch up with him on a regular basis. We have a good relationship. He is deeply interested in visiting the church here in Coburn. It hasn't opened yet, but once it does, he's deeply interested in visiting the church in Coburn. And he's still fully engaged in getting to know who God is and studying his Bible. So just because someone has said no in a particular scenario doesn't mean that they're completely uninterested. Sometimes it's just the approach they're rejecting and not necessarily God. So, all right, I'm going to move on because we're wrapping up here. The church today is perfectly calibrated for a world that no longer exists. And I think we need to contend with that. And it's an uncomfortable statement, but we need to wrestle with the fact that there has been a big shift in the world around us. So how are we going to reach people who inhabit a kind of world that is completely foreign to us, and we inhabit a world that's completely foreign to them? There has to be some bridge building. And so that's what the solution is. There is a solution. There is a way forward in this. And in fact, I will close by saying that I believe if anyone has the chance to reach this new generation with this apathy toward God, if any church on the world has the chance to do a phenomenal job at reaching them, it's the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I believe that the way that we understand truth, the way that we understand prophecy, the way that we understand the character of God speaks directly into many of the reasons why people today want nothing to do with God. It speaks directly into them and provides a healthy picture of God that has healing potential and power. So when we get together again, that'll be next Friday, 7 p.m. What I'll do is, it won't be a lecture like today. Today was more, I just wanted to lay the foundation, give you guys the panorama. But the next one, we're actually going to start looking at practical things. Okay, if you are encountering people like this in your workplace, in your school, in your neighborhood. In fact, for some of you, it may even be your own kids. If you are encountering people that inhabit this way of thinking and relating to the world around them, how do you reach them, right? How do you share when they don't care? So we're going to get into some real practical stuff next Friday. I'm really looking forward to that. But yeah, other than that, I am done. It's 7:59. I told you guys I'd be done by 8. I kept my promise. But I'm also interested, if anyone has any questions, I'm more than happy to take any questions as well.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, that was really good. Thanks.
Was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Yep. Thank you. I know there was a lot there. Hopefully it was simple enough. And this has been recorded, and I'll put it on our, I'll work with David to have it on our YouTube. So you can go back and watch it again if you need to refresh as well. All right. No questions. Fantastic. It's 8 p.m. Let me pray for you guys. Let you guys go. I'll be at church tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it. So I'm looking forward to doing communion with you guys and eating some good food. It's been a little while. So let's pray, and I'll see you there. Father in heaven, thank you for the chance that you've given us to take the time to talk about you and your mission in the world today. Here's the truth, God. The world today presents some unique challenges to the mission of the church, but the reality is every generation has presented challenges to the mission of the church. They're different challenges. They change, they ebb and they flow, and they shift and they morph. But every generation has presented challenges to the mission of the church. I'm thinking of the early church with the persecution by the Jewish authorities and the Roman authorities. I mean, how difficult must it have been to share the gospel in such a hostile world? And yet through the power of your Spirit and through humble hearts that were willing to be filled by you and reach out to their neighbors, you were able to turn the world upside down, as it says in the book of Acts. And I believe the same can happen today, Lord. So give us that humble heart, fill us with your Spirit. Help us to understand the world around us and seek to engage them in ways that are going to be effective at lifting Jesus up. Because I believe the promise of Jesus in Scripture. We all believe the promise of Jesus in Scripture. We want to declare that promise tonight, that when he is lifted up, he will draw all men to himself. So may we live lives like that, Lord. May we live lives that lift Jesus up, even in our apathetic city of Meh. May we lift Jesus up in such a way that others are drawn to him. Thank you again, and bless us now as we close in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 All right, you guys. I'll see you all tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Adios.